So I don't get this comic. We've got this kid that turns into a Charmander, but like 300 pages in, he still hasn't started his rescue team. Wait, this isn't a Mystery Dungeon comic? Here we are with my very first comic review. This is kind of a tough one to review if I'm honest. There are so many things to really like about this, but at the same time, it falls short a lot. Hopefully I'll be able to explain why without sounding too nitpicky. So our story begins with Cole, who awakens in the body of a Charmander and is soon captured by trainer Brian Wheaton. Brian is only just starting out his journey and still has a lot to learn. Cole, who is named Charlie by the unwitting Brian, is taken along for the ride and gets to experience what the world is like for a Pokemon on a trainer's team. We get battles, new characters that have to learn to get along, a new world to explore, characters having breakdowns, a villain that just likes to be a villain, all sorts of things. As I view myself as more of a storyteller, most of my review will be focused on the story of Char-Cole, but I will touch on other topics as well. So how does the story fare? Well, overall, pretty good. I'll come right out and say I have very conflicting feelings about this comic. What I like most is that it takes storylines we've seen before and puts a twist on them. There were many points in the story where I thought I had a grasp on what it was doing and was making predictions. Most of my predictions turned out to be wrong. A story that will keep me guessing throughout has a lot of good things going for it. It's treading ground we've all seen before, but still giving it its own flavor. It can tell the same stories, but still feel unique while doing so. My main problem with the story, though, is that it doesn't quite do enough for the reader to help the reader along. Let me explain. Bear with me here. In the very beginning of the comic, Cole awakens as the Charmander, and then is immediately captured. That's our intro into the comic. We don't know who Cole is, we don't know who Brian is, we don't know where we are, we don't know when, we're just kind of thrown into the story. As readers, you just kind of have to piece together things as you go. While this cold opening might work in a Mystery Dungeon comic, it only does so because, for the most part, the character doesn't remember anything before that moment either. The reader isn't supposed to know, so the character doesn't know. If Cole's backstory didn't play that much into his character arc in the story, this would be fine too. But a lot of what he deals with in the comic is addressing issues he had with his regular human life. Since we never get to actually see it, we just kinda have to take Cole's word for it that all of his angst is justified. This problem is compounded with the main character conflict Cole starts to go through. He begins questioning who he is and whether life would just be better if he stayed a Charmander. While reading this, I was rather confused as where it came from, as to me, it came right out of left field. I was only just barely getting a grasp of his character and he starts questioning if that actually was his character. In order to follow along with a character and their development, you need to see a starting point, to see what they were like before the conflict starts. This way you can gauge how they've grown and improved, or even maybe how the story is negatively affecting them. Because we have no starting point with Cole, it's hard to say if he's changed, how he's changed, or even if he should change. Other aspects of the story that didn't quite agree with me might be hard to talk about without going into spoilers or without me just really tearing everything apart. I will say that at some points there seemed like logical gaps that could have used better explaining. Cole starts to have episodes where he gives into the Charmander's instincts, and each time it's supposed to be a traumatic and dangerous experience. But after each occurrence, I had to scratch my head at what the problem was. At worst, he started a few trees on fire. He never seriously injured anyone, friends or foe. He seemed to be able to speak as he normally would, so it's not like he completely disappears. He just kicks butt in a fight for a bit and then turns back to normal. Since no impact of this is shown, it's hard to take this plot point seriously. This may have just been a problem with the technical side of the comic, which we will touch on later. I do not want to come off all negative. Like I said, this comic has a lot of great things going for it. Apart from the unique feel, this comic comes off to me as a bit smarter than most. It really delves into the psychological effects each character is going through, whether it be from something in the current storyline or before we are introduced to them. They have in-depth conversations with each other about how they feel and why they feel that way. I also really like the detail they put into making Pokemon different from humans. Most of the focus is on Cole and the other team members, while the humans in the story usually take a back seat to what's going on. The comic makes it very clear that Pokemon minds do not work like human minds. There are a few scenes where they come out and say it, but there are also more subtle things. For instance, most of the Pokemon, when learning about Cole being a human, think the idea is crazy, but more or less give off the impression that it doesn't matter either way. This contrasts well with the few instances of a human learning about Cole that either right out don't believe it or need extensive proof as backup. A lot of my enjoyment in the comic came from the different ways the story showed how the Pokemon characters reacted to their situation, and how those cases probably wouldn't work so well if the character was human. So all in all, the story has a lot of great things going for it. There are some things here and there that make the reader either have to just go along with it or make leaps of logic, but when it properly explains everything and gets that moment right, boy does it get it right. Here's where I might seem like I'm really nitpicky, so I apologize in advance. Char-Cole takes place in a made-up region of Lazo, I'm guessing it said. Making up a whole new region is quite an endeavor to take on, so props to Kairio. There is a map and everything on the comic site that shows the character's progress. There are towns and forests, each with their own characters we run into, and it has its own league and gym leaders. But I fail to see why it needed to be its own region. First off, the Pokemon we encounter for the most part are all from Generation 1, meaning this could have just as easily happened in Kanto. Secondly, I have yet to see anything that really sets Lazo apart. In canon regions, you can pretty much name landmarks or other important places. Kanto has Silphco, the Pokemon Tower, Cycling Road, and more. Hoenn has the Devon Corporation, a volcano, cities on the water and in the trees. If you think about each region, it isn't hard to see what separates it from the others. As of where we are in the comic right now, the only thing Lazo has really shown as far as a landmark is a lake near a forest. Not saying that the artwork for it was bad, but it was just nothing that set it apart. The only thing that sorta sets Lazo apart is the gyms seem to focus on 2 types instead of 1, but even that hasn't really been showcased or fully developed yet. But still, it's just something with the league and not with the region itself. Lazo is just simply underdeveloped. The only time I remember they were somewhere else is when they'd mention a town name now and again. It needs some history or something that makes it stand out from the other regions so we can care about it. This doesn't mean that the setting of the story is necessarily bad, it just needs more work so the reader can care about it, and so that all the effort in making a new region isn't wasted. I don't consider myself an artist as much, so you can take this as you will. The art in the beginning was a sketchy style. The line art gradually gets smoother and smoother as it goes. After we get into the 300s, the comic also introduces color, which was needed on many levels that I'll explain more in a minute. A lot of my issues that I had as far as the presentation seem to have been corrected as time went on. The first 100 or 200 pages were more like strips. This may just be a personal thing, but I don't usually care for story-centered comics to be told in a comic strip format. It leaves the scenes feeling disjointed, and if you don't end on a punchline, it's like something was missing. After a while, it did go into full-page formatting. At first I had serious trouble with making page layouts that made sense and could be easily read in the right order. It didn't help that there usually weren't word bubbles. This made it difficult to tell who was talking, and on many pages there were multiple conversations going on, so things were usually lost. But again, these issues have been largely addressed, and we have more cohesive layouts and word bubbles. As for the art itself, it's very good. It has its highs and lows, and you can definitely see the improvement as the story goes on. If I had any problem with the art itself, it was in the humans. I fall into this trap myself, but the humans more or less look the same but with different hair. This was so much the case that when it introduced a very different looking human in Professor Cedar, he seemed rather alien. But as the humans don't play as much into the story, this isn't a big mark against it. In fact, when it introduces Pokemon of the same species, those ones are easy to tell apart, so I found that interesting. I'm not sure where else to talk about this. This is probably the best place. Text size. The text is usually way too small. It is slightly better on the newer pages, but I still had to be zoomed in to 150% to read everything comfortably. Maybe it's just my browser or the site layout, but if the image and the text size could be increased, that would probably be a good thing. Last thing that I don't know where to put really, the comic had a slight issue with keeping its audience rating in mind. At first there was no swearing. Then swearing was used, but it was all censored. Now swearing is used in its fullest form. It's not that swearing turns me away, but keeping something like that consistent throughout is important. Again, this is a problem that has been addressed in the latest pages, but the majority of the comic had the problem of usually being zoomed in on the characters' faces while they were talking. You can only look at the same 3/4 angle of the characters' faces before everything tends to blend together. Add in that shading, color, and grayscale was usually not utilized. Pages more often than not looked the same. Backgrounds are basically non-existent. This made keeping track of where they were, even in relation to each other, very difficult. Many pages consisted of just the face and text, making it a lot of just white space. So when shading started being used, and eventually color, it was very, very refreshing. It was a lot easier to tell what was what and keeping the characters grounded in their location. We have yet to see one of Cole's episodes properly in this new format, so it might help clear up any confusion I had with it. When the consequence of his attack seemed to just be a little puff of smoke, it is hard to take it all seriously. Hopefully now that we have color, use of backgrounds, and zooming out from their faces, the impact of Cole's actions might become clearer. But what did the comic get right? The action. Oh, the action. As said, most of the pages consisted of the characters' faces and text. So when there was a fight, we actually got to see full body shots. Maybe this made the action scenes stand out much more than from the normal pages, but boy did I love the action scenes. Cole trained in martial arts and used those skills while fighting as a Charmander. That made even simple poses and blocks look visually interesting. The fight scenes were usually short, and sometimes the lack of backgrounds made it a little hard to follow, but these factors were not distracting. The later action scenes managed to blend the drama in with the fighting quite seamlessly, making it quite impressive to watch. I hope to see the fight scenes continue to develop and become even more entertaining than they already were. One of the most important aspects of a story to me, do I like the characters or do I care about their journey? Like the overall story, this is a bit hit and miss. The main issue is with Cole himself, since he is taking up most of the screen time. One of my pet peeves with characters and character development is when a character has to have their issue and their solution to that issue explained to them, instead of learning and growing from it themselves. I know that is something that can just apply to me, however. Cole is having a lot of self-doubt, but the way this self-doubt is introduced is by having another character explain that's what he's having. Granted, this is a representation of himself that he talks to, but since this is being presented as a separate entity, I'm gonna treat it as such. Every time Cole has a problem, a character tells him that he has that problem, and usually how he should go about fixing it. There are several instances where Cole contemplates returning home or leaving Brian. What makes him stay? Another character asks him to stay. He doesn't seem to have any kind of bond with Brian from what I can tell, and never decides this on his own. He just is asked, and so he stays. This is probably frustrating to me because when Cole isn't fussing over his problems, I actually find him to be a pretty interesting character. He seems to win me over, but then has another breakdown and loses me again. So it's not that I dislike Cole, I just have a hard time connecting with how he faces conflict. With other characters, it's hard to have complaints about them. They are unique and interesting in their own little ways. If I did have any negatives with the other characters, it's that as of now they don't seem to be showing any progression. They are for the most part as they were when they were introduced. Maybe it's just too soon to tell though. but this is only a problem with most of the cast. The trainer Brian does seem to be growing as a character and becoming stronger and more competent. This strikes me as odd though, because he actually gets the least amount of page time compared to his team. There are a couple of cases where he has short lessons with Cole, but for the most part he seems to be growing and developing off-screen. It's hard to say how much longer the story of Char-Cole will be, seeing as Brian still hasn't officially earned a gym badge, so it's possible this will be addressed as we go. Still though, it's really the characters that kept me going through the reading, since Cole's drama never really clicked with me. Just seeing them interacting and finding new messes to get into is entertaining enough. Of course, we do have a standout character. And I'm probably gonna say this wrong too, but Mao, the villain of the story, he's a Mew that's basically bored, so he messes with our cast. He was far and above the most interesting character to me. It's a shame he hasn't gotten much screen time. It's kind of an odd position he is currently in. I appreciate that he's not the center of every conflict the cast has encountered, but at the same time, I just wanted him around more. It's a hard balance to find when trying to determine how much to use a character like that. Less can be more and all that. So for what we get of him, he's great. It's like I want more of him, but not too much more. So, Char-Cole. It's a comic that when it gets something right, it usually hits it out of the park. It's still clearly developing, and a lot of the problems I currently have with it seem to be working themselves out. It still has room to grow and improve, but was in no way a waste of time. I think the things that are so good in it are what make the problems I have with it so much worse than they actually are. So I hope I did not come across too negative. If you're looking for a comic with a brain and some good action, this comic is definitely one to check out.